Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. God of War Ragnarök came out and surprise surprise, it's good. I won't talk through the story because this is definitely a game you're going to want to play. Even if you think you've been spoiled silly, you should still play the game. And speaking of spoilers, I'm about to spoil this entire game. Everything you wouldn't want to know, I'm going to talk about. Last warning. Alright, so the story is immaculate and not in the way you'd think. Going into this after the last game, I was actually a bit nervous that they'd take the easy route. They'd make Freya a side antagonist, they'd kill off Mimir, they'd split Kratos and Atreus after all the growth they've just had, and yeah, that would ruin the last game. But luckily they basically did the exact opposite of all that. First off is the main big boy, Kratos. Kratos is great in this game. From the very beginning we can see him being more open with Atreus and more thoughtful about others than he ever was in the last game. But as the story goes on, he gets tested with just how open to change he can be. It is interesting to note that he doesn't really want to pursue Tyr in the beginning, but also refuses Odin's deal. And don't worry, we'll talk about Odin later. And yeah, he really does become more open as the story goes on, in his own way. From talking to his companions about his past, to admitting in Alfheim that he's scared he hasn't spent enough time with Atreus, this is probably the most normal Kratos we've seen, and he consistently proves in this game that he is changing. But when talking about his son, it's a bit different. The main concern going into this game was that Kratos and Atreus would become divided, and it would wreck everything that the last game built in terms of story. And it kinda does, but in the only way that works. Atreus visits Asgard in search of answers, and when he returns, you'd think that Kratos would be more peeved than ever at his son. But instead, he shows another huge sign of development when asking, "What should I call you?" And yeah, I guess this could be a really forced gender identity message, but to me it's more about Kratos accepting that his son is going to have to be his own person. Atreus is Atreus, but to Kratos, Atreus is his son, and in the end it's really the trust between the two of them that makes their relationship stronger than ever. When Atreus skips off to Asgard on his own, I imagine that this was the game's way of saying, we could separate these two narratively, but then they return him to Sindri's house for a reunion with his father, and they form an even stronger bond of trust. I also really had a lot of apprehension about Atreus being playable. Not because it isn't absolutely awesome and cool, but because I thought that they were setting up playing as Atreus when Kratos died at the end. Luckily that was not the case, and the Atreus sections remain awesome, and the transitions between him and Kratos are actually incredibly well done. There's a bit more to their story thematically, but I'll talk more about that later. For now, we talk about my least favorite character in the last game, Freya. Freya is by far the biggest improvement this game has in terms of story. They gave her more to do in the beginning in terms of performance and writing, but they keep that going by making her a full companion by the end. I like that her and Kratos form a tighter bond as they regale each other of stories of their past. I also like that her main goal throughout most of the game is to kill Odin, whether or not everything works out in Ragnarök. And I think that if you don't appreciate her character very much, it'd do you well to explore Vanaheim. There's even an upgrade or two you can acquire for her there. And you learn a ton about her past and her love for the realm. Definitely an upgrade in terms of story and writing, and there was more to do for the VA, so I appreciated that. I think there's not a bad argument for just how fast she switches herself to a complete ally to Kratos, but I think that's just a product of my playthrough being really fast. Her brother was also a nice addition to her character, seemingly nice, but also kinda suspicious. But then he sacrifices himself, so that was cool. The sword was also pretty dope. I should also mention Faye, who is played by the amazing Deborah Ann Woll, who you can find in the Daredevil series as well. I like that we get to see her in the game and we get to learn of her good nature. I also like that we get count it, three dream sequences with her. No more, no less, and that's all we needed. And now, for Brok and Sindri, another great improvement over last game. I said once that I'd like to have more story for them, and that itch was scratched by this game. Brok gets a ton to talk about and do, and he's honestly a bit tragic in this game. He died and left behind a chunk of his soul and was treated like a black sheep by his own people. But in the most baller moment in the entire God of War franchise, Brok is the only one in the entire game, sometimes including the player, who sees through Tyr's madness. He's the only one who pieces together that something's wrong, because that's how much of a real one Brok is. That he sees through the biggest deception ever, and then he is promptly killed for it, which actually really serves Sindri's story, sad as it is. This sends Sindri into a downward spiral of hate. He kills innocent Midgardians, albeit kind of by accident, and he cusses out Atreus and actually makes good points. Like he isn't appreciative enough, and he's given Atreus all of his magical items. His entire character model is changed to be distraught and unnerving, which is a side of Sindri that actually stays for the rest of the story. Like, Atreus doesn't even really make up with him, which I can't even blame him. The best thing about Sindri's character in this game is obviously that he's the one who gets to deal the final blow against Odin for his vengeance for Brok. And he doesn't even skip a beat before doing so. And then he sends Brok off and leaves. There's really not much of a resolution after that. I don't know if I dislike it because it's not always as simple as a conversation to heal wounds. But now, we have to get into the really good stuff. The villains. First, we'll start off with Thor, just like the game did. He's actually really cool. First of all, if you just look at his character model, it's the chubbiest, buffest dude ever. Like, I want to comment on his beer belly, but I don't want to get absolutely clapped doing so. But even so, I kind of like how chill he is. He's sober now, which Odin dislikes, and he barely even picks fights. I mean, the only reason we fight him at all is because we killed a chunk of his family, which, I mean, yeah. But his redemption isn't something cheesy and dumb. He doesn't sacrifice himself in some kind of game-breaking moment, but it's more of a promise to be better before his father kills him. His love for Sif and his daughter are the things that kept him sober for a while, and they are ultimately the things he fights for the whole game, right up until the end. And now, the big bad. The All-Father. Odin is probably the best villain of the game. From his introduction, he almost looks meek and helpless, and he really does spend the entire game manipulating everyone. From posing as Tyr to acting the way he did towards Atreus, he really lives up to his precedents in terms of manipulation tactics. I also like that the writing for him is directly in line with the last game, as he really does want to know everything there is to know and is willing to do anything to pursue that goal, manipulate or kill whoever he has to. And at the end of the game, as he spent the whole time just talking his way through what's happened, it's almost a slap in the face when he pulls out his spear and kills his son. And his boss fight is suitably epic, although I do wish it was a bit more difficult. I beat it first try. But that's not to say I wasn't put on the ropes once or twice during that fight. And yeah, I already mentioned it, but Sindri's the one who gets to kill Odin after what happened to Brock. That's awesome, that's epic. As for some of the other side characters like Atreus' friends, they're fine. Thrud, Thor's daughter, is a strong young woman with lightning powers who wants to be a Valkyrie. She's cool, and I think it's a great detail that the two weapons she uses are very similar to Magni and Modi's. Angerboda has her own really cool story about changing her own fate, and I liked every part she played in the game, but I do wish Kratos could have had an extended interaction with her during the main story. It could have been a nice moment. And then the Midgardian kid that Atreus meets looks inhuman. As for this game's story overall, it's amazing. We get a cool interaction with Thor and Odin straight off, and a cool fight as well. We spend time with Kratos and Atreus separately, which allows their characters to breathe a bit, but then they're reunited, which is the best part of the story in my opinion. But then there's also the twist of Tyr actually being Odin the whole time, and the only teeny tiny problem I have with this moment is that the actual Tyr, who you can find imprisoned in Niflheim, doesn't get nearly enough to do, unfortunately. You can find him hanging around the realms, I guess, but it was a good twist nonetheless. But now, we can talk about the end. Ragnarok, the name of the game and the battle to end all battles. It does live up to its name, in my estimation. You fight alongside the Valkyries from the last game, you fight alongside Dark Elves, and you even have an army of the dead. It's a lot of spectacle when you're running around fighting Einherjar, but then we get to the finale. Thor's semi-sacrifice and Odin's demise. I don't think it could have been done any better. Odin gets his comeuppance, Sindri gets his revenge, Freya gets her justice, Freyr gets the awesome sacrifice, Angerboda becomes a fate breaker, Thor gets his redemption, Atreus gets his chance to solidify himself as a really smart and strong fighter, and Kratos finally gets the fresh start he was trying for in the original game. But not in the way he thought. And everyone, in terms of story, is better off than the beginning of the game. But obviously, the story is only half of the game, no matter how perfect. Gameplay is another thing we have to touch on, and is it truly an improvement over the last game that feels satisfying to use? Yes, absolutely, and let me explain why. But I do want to tell you guys real quick to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy. Let's continue on. First of all, Kratos in himself gets the Leviathan Axe and the Blades of Chaos, and new elemental abilities for both. I think if we only played as Kratos and we didn't get a new weapon, I'd have more of a problem with this, but obviously that's not how it panned out. We also get to play as Atreus. I really wasn't looking forward to combat once the camera did that little pan behind Atreus' back to switch to third person, but it holds up surprisingly well. It almost feels like the Horizon games in terms of how the bow and arrows function, but actually better in terms of smooth melee combat and fun runic attacks. I also like that we get 6 times the companions in this game, being Atreus, Freya, Ingrid, Brock, Sindri, and Angerboda. Even if they're story locked for the most part, I admire the lengths the team went to make sure you always have a little bit of help on your side. But back to Kratos. The blades feel a bit more powerful and balanced with the other weapons than the last game, where they felt a bit weak. As for the axe, it still strikes true and is a blast to use, and I really like how satisfying it feels to frost up the axe. But I suppose the real highlight is the Draupnir spear, which yeah, it's probably the coolest weapon in the entire game. Seeing as it's an awesome spear of wind, akin to the way Aang uses his staff in the Avatar show, but it can also replicate infinitely, leading to awesome takedowns and cool throwing mechanics. It's also a bit funny how the devs didn't seem to care at all about placing spear throw locations everywhere before you even get it, and I guess it worked because I didn't figure it out until we were making it. I guess I just assumed that they'd never make new traversal animations for Kratos and the companions, but they did, and that's sick. Speaking of the companions, they all pretty much play the same, but I like Freya the most. It feels a lot more like we're working together, whereas the others it kind of feels like they're just helping out. But you play the free play of this game with her, so that's a really good thing. I already touched a bit on Atreus' combat, but obviously it's really good. And I was shocked to see just how big the skill tree was for Freya and Atreus both. This game feels a lot less limited on resources, and you can tell from the moment you load in. As for their runic arrow types, I really like them both, probably more this time than last time. Sonic arrows are great for a whole pack of enemies in terms of stun damage and normal, but sigil arrows really shine if you're fighting just one bigger enemy, so you can deal a lot more elemental damage. And that goes for boss fights too. This was the main thing I was concerned about after last game, and the team really pulled through. You have the first spectacle fight with Thor that lived up to the hype, you have multiple Valkyrie fights, one with Freya and then a dual one. You also have a fight with Heimdall when you acquire the new spear, which is also sick and satisfying, seeing as we haven't been able to touch him the entire game. You have what I consider to be a runner-up best fight in the game with Garm, with awesome music and another great spectacle. You have the bear in the beginning, along with Grilla. You have the final Thor fight, and then you have the Allfather battle. All of which were absolutely epic in just about every way. But now we have to talk about the actual world of the game. All 9 realms are now here, something we knew to be true since the last game, and there is a problem or two, but I'll touch on that later. The first realm I want to talk about is Alfheim. It's an absolute upgrade from the last game, if you ask me. I always hated taking that really slow boat into a realm full of enemies that are inconsistently stronger or weaker than you and are always trying to blind you. But now that we fight a lot more light elves, it feels a lot more balanced. Not even to mention that it has some of the coolest visuals and side quests in the entire game. I really enjoyed all the new things we got to learn about the War for the Light and Freyr's involvement. And now for Niflheim, which I really like. It's probably my favorite realm visually, and although I was sad that Evaldi's workshop didn't make a return, I also didn't really mind as much. Instead, the long-term challenge is to kill all of Hodin's ravens and to explore a small prison, which is cool. That, and you can practice all your moves in a little arena. I'm glad they went with a colder approach to the realm this time, because it holds to Norse mythology a lot better. The next realm is Jotunheim. It's probably the most normal, but I do like that they didn't make it look like a desert landscape like in the last game. It looks a lot more vibrant and interesting. Going back to this realm at the end really just gives you more story with Angerboda, which I guess gives her a scene with Kratos, so that's cool. I think it's pretty clear you won't get to free roam in Asgard. It doesn't really have the open world vibes that the other realms have, but I do enjoy its look during the story nonetheless. And I'm positive that someone's complained about how many Einherjar there are in this game, which comes from Asgard, but they're probably my top 3 enemies, so I didn't mind. And the Bifrost Blasts were a cool idea in terms of gameplay mechanics. I also like that Asgard isn't some over-the-top place where everything is gold and covered in rubies and stuff, but it's just like a place where a bunch of Vikings would probably hang out. Oh, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the Var fight scene with Atreus is absolutely phenomenal and a great time. Vanaheim is probably the realm with the most depth, which I don't mind since it's our first time here. I really just like how much area there is to explore and how many unlockables there are. There's even new enemies you can find that aren't anywhere in the story, so it'd be a really good start to exploring the realms on a 100% playthrough. The realm looks amazing as well, with an artificial day-night cycle that adds a lot stylistically either way you play. I was also genuinely shocked when an entire other half of the realm opened up out of nowhere. Like, I knew we had to find a way to use Freyr's boat somehow, but I also kind of forgot about it. And I'd probably say that this realm is to this game as Midgard was to the last game. Most of your free roam will be spent here. And if you think Vanaheim isn't very big, then you just haven't done enough exploring. Trust me, it really does go deeper. Helheim is actually the realm with the least to do in the entire game aside from Jotunheim, but again, you get the amazing boss fight with Garm, so I'll complain about nothing here. Then we have Svartalfheim, another bigger realm in terms of story and gameplay. It's absolutely stunning in a detailed way, and I actually really like the unique enemies. Plus, we get a lot of unique backgrounds with smaller scale buildings because it's where the dwarves live. And we get a really cool interior with all the explorable mines. 10 out of 10 realm, would smell again. Muspelheim is a bit of a weird one for me. It's a very fun realm, and I like the idea of having to do different combinations of challenges to get different rewards. I also like that Ganaz hanging out nearby in the realm is a single but incredibly difficult Valkyrie boss fight. But I guess I just wish there was a bit more to the Crucible in itself. It took me like maybe an hour to complete all of the challenges, including the main difficult ones. Maybe if you do all the combinations, you can get another higher level of combinations for the God tier rewards and armor, but that's a small complaint. The last realm I'll talk about is Midgard, which is my favorite. It absolutely slaps in design and feel, and it's cool that there are more NPCs in the world, even if they are just raider camps. I also like that a lot of the Midgard stuff is more lore focused than anything, but there are still raiders and berserkers around, the latter of which I'll get to soon. There's also a single troll that you can fight, which is one of the only trolls I can think of in the entire game. I never really minded how many troll fights there were in 2018's game, but I guess the devs just wanted to flex just how little the trolls matter in this game by having like 3 or 4, one of which you kill in the span of 2 seconds during a cutscene. But now that Fimbulwinter and the fight with Thor has happened, Midgard feels so different from the last game that it's definitely my favorite realm to visit. I guess I'll take a bit of a side note and say that traversal in general in this game is also profoundly improved. You swing around and jump taller barriers with the blades, and you can ride around in a dog sled, and you can travel between realms using world tree portals instead of the realm travel room, which is great. I like that it feels nice and linear like the last game, but not as much of a slog as climbing around constantly and using a boat that goes 0.2 miles an hour sometimes. I was also a bit concerned that they'd make every combat encounter have multiple levels, and they didn't do that, which is good. Sometimes I just want to barrel my way through an arena, not have to sift through the different layers like Donkey. There are also something called berserkers in this game, which I guess constitute as a challenge akin to the Valkyries in the last game. I like them, but I think we could stand to have a bit more story from them. In terms of gameplay, they're a real challenge, some more so than others. And I know I already mentioned Gná, but I don't think I actually conveyed how challenging she is. Probably not Valkyrie Queen level in terms of attempts, but she has so many new attacks that it will take you a while to get them down. But I actually like the significance it holds for Freya, and that sometimes she'll help you block or dodge attacks. She even gets new armor when you beat Gná, so that's cool. Speaking of side missions in general, I don't think there are quite as many in this game, just like 2 or 3 less, but they all feel more important and more rewarding. And I'd even argue that they're more fun. You can get different resources completely separate from the story and also get completely new enemies. This game feels the most worth it for going the extra mile and exploring the realms completely, and that's if you don't just want to look at them, because honestly, they're gorgeous to see as well. After playing God of War 2018 and The Last of Us games, I've gotten good at hitting every little nook and area, but even then, sometimes coming back to the realms after a while, it offers rewards I never even spotted. It's truly a game with a metric ton of depth to its story, exploration, and its gameplay. And then there's a little miscellaneous stuff that isn't really acknowledged, but it's still really cool. Like the fact that when you build up permafrost, you can switch to the blades and it's built up for the blades too, which was something that annoyed me in the last game. Or just how many shields there are, Jesus Christ. Or even just how cool the new sigil arrows are in terms of functionality. Like whoever came up with those should be the king or queen of all ideas ever. But for this last segment of video, I'd like to talk about a theme of this game. It's changing fate, which is cool because that was probably a basis for the entire God of War franchise anyway. Just how far would the story go along with the mythology? And seeing as this game is probably the least in line with the original mythology in the series, they took that theme to heart this time. But with all the prophecies and all the paths already being set, Kratos and Atreus set out to forge their own, and I think any other way would have been worse. When Kratos visits the Fates, they mock him by saying that they don't really know fate or anything like that, but they say Kratos is so predictable that they know where he'll end up. And the game treats you the same way, like when Heimdall mocks you for picking up Hacksilver in Asgard, or when Odin knows that Atreus is listening in on his conversation with Thor, or even when Thor admonishes you for trying to summon your axe. It's almost embarrassing anytime you're called out for it, but it lines up perfectly with the themes of fate and predictability. You could not do any of those things and be fine, but the devs knew you would. I almost would have liked the ending to be some kind of choice, but the only problem is that I don't think a lot of players would get the point of forging your own path and would choose wrong, which would cap off the story wrong. So I think that the ending goes along with the message of the game and not accepting your fate just because it's written. This video would not be complete without a shout out to Bear McCreary, who scored this game in the last game along with a few other big projects. This game has one of, if not the best score I've ever heard in a video game, somehow topping last game's, if you can believe it. Remember the sick music for the main dragon in the last game, Horazilier? Well, Bear seemingly repurposed it and actually made it more distorted and cool for the Garm fight in Hell. That's literally some of the coolest music I've ever heard, and I was shocked it wasn't in the official soundtrack. And then there's the relationship between this game and the last. This game isn't better in the traditional way, but in more of a once you've beaten it, you simply won't believe that the previous game is better. And yeah, this game obviously gets the 4th 10 on the channel, but I promise this is the last perfect game I'll be making a video on for at least a little while. And obviously, if this and the last game have the same number score, then they'll have the same quality, right? No, that's not really true. Not that God of War 2018 is any worse than Ragnarok, but Ragnarok is better if you can wrap your mind around that. And now I give the topmost reward to this game. As of right now, this is the best game I've made a video on, or that has been included in a video. I guess we'll see how long it takes for that to change, and yeah, it's gonna be a pretty long time if you ask me. Remember, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people. Oh, and as for the disappointing thing that this video is named after, I was really just disappointed in the fact that Garm's fight theme didn't really end up in the official soundtrack for the game, and I can't find it on YouTube, so yeah, that's about it. Play nice, people.